Today we're going to talk about a group of soldiers who in recent years have been getting more attention, and that is the Buffalo Soldiers. Aside from being known from a Bob Marley song, the Buffalo Soldiers were instrumental not only in the expansion of the American West, but also for African Americans in the US military. Today I'm going to be telling the story of the Buffalo Soldiers, from their bombastic beginnings in the late 19th century to their underwhelming end in the mid 20th century. This is the story of their triumph and their tragedy. Blacks in the American military have been around since its beginning during the American Revolution. Whether they would be slaves or free, they would fight for the United States despite not being considered citizens and being treated poorly and not given the credit that they deserved. At the start of the American Civil War, which you have to remind people that it was fought over
slavery! Oh, right. I am so embarrassed.
Many free blacks and escaped slaves would join up with the Union Army, starting with the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. Despite being segregated, given jobs and assignments that were below them, and being paid less than their white counterparts, African American troops would prove themselves on the battlefield with bravery and honor. When the war was over, the United States military focused all its attention west, where they would constantly fight native tribes. Seeing the actions of the black troops from the Civil War, the United States Army decided to create its own division of black soldiers. Here we were made up of 2 cavalry regiments and 4 infantry regiments. The cavalry was made up of the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments, while the infantry was made up of the 38th, 39th, 40th, and 41st Infantry Regiment, though these regiments would be combined to make the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. These units were mostly led by white commanders. At the time, the US Army had a quota that only 10 to 20% of blacks could join the military. This was to represent the exact ideal of the population of the United States at the time, and the fact they didn't want many blacks joining. That being said, those that managed to join felt proud about it. You see, when slavery ended, blacks had trouble finding jobs as they had to compete with white workers, specifically against Irish and German immigrants. So in a cruel sense of irony, this led to many going back to work on the plantations that they used to be enslaved at. So for a lot of black men, this was seen as the better option. Still, these divisions would even establish black officers such as Henry O. Flipper, the first black graduate of West Point. And they have to give mention to Cathay Williams, the first and only female member who joined the army disguised as a man, but was discharged when it was discovered that she was a woman. And if you want to call it a black Mulan, then by all means do so. Though this was a very common thing that happened back in the day. Still, this will only be the beginning for these colored troops. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the colored divisions of the United States Army would fight Native American tribes. It was here where they would show off their combat skills, proving themselves to be just as capable, if not better, than their white counterparts. Here the Native Americans would give the black troops the name the Buffalo Soldiers. Now many don't know the reason why these troops were given that name. Some believe that it was because the black troops fought fiercely like that of an American bison, though the most popular belief is that they were called that due to their hair being similar to one. Despite the origin, the troops took pride in the name, and even the 10th Cavalry used the buffalo as their insignia and even their regimental song. The 9th Cavalry would fight in the Midwest Plains, while the 10th Cavalry fought in the Southwest deserts. Here they would fight various native tribes such as the Apache, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux. Along with fighting Native Americans, the Buffalo Soldiers would also serve as law enforcement as they would take down many outlaws in the Old West. And they would even be sent to settle disputes among cattle ranchers who were fighting each other to see where their cows can go. Here 23, the Buffalo Soldiers will be awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest award. Still, despite the bravery of these soldiers, they still experience harsh racism from their superiors. Many white officers refused to lead colored troops as the belief at the time was that black soldiers were weak and scared easily, with even the most famous generals such as George Custer not wanting to lead colored soldiers. But maybe, if he had Buffalo Soldiers with him at the Battle of Little Bighorn, maybe he would have survived, but that's none of my business. Even among the Native Americans, the Buffalo Soldiers were viewed with disdain, as while they respected them as warriors, Native tribes saw the Buffalo Soldiers as tools for the white man's invasion and genocide of their peoples. Which, yeah, they weren't wrong. With one of the more shameful acts of the Buffalo Soldiers is where they were policed the Pine Ridge Reservation during and after the events of the Wounded Knee Massacre, where US soldiers killed about 300 members of the Lakota tribe. Once the West was conquered, the Buffalo Soldiers would go into their next fight, which was farther than what they would expect. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain to help Cuban rebels and avenge the explosion of the battleship USS Maine, even though the Spanish had nothing to do with the latter. Here, the Buffalo Soldiers would play a huge part in the war, where they would fight alongside the famous Rough Riders led by future American President Theodore Roosevelt. Here, they would take part in the battles of Guasma and San Juan Hill, where they would face the brunt of Spanish forces. It is here where 5 of the soldiers will receive the Medal of Honor, with even Roosevelt at first speaking highly of the colored troops. But as his popularity began to rise, he would sadly disregard the actions of these soldiers, making them a footnote in the war even though they did most of the fighting. And unfortunately, this is where things start to go downhill for the Buffalo Soldiers. For those who don't know, the Caribbean wasn't the only front in the Spanish-American War. The US also fought Spain in the then Spanish colony of the Philippines. Here, the Americans would help Filipino rebels fight against the Spanish. However, once the control of the Philippines went from Spain to the United States, many Filipinos felt cheated out of their independence. So the same rebels that fought alongside American troops would now fight against them. In 1899, the Buffalo Soldiers would be sent to crush the Filipino rebellion. While the Buffalo Soldiers fought bravely during the conflict, with one example of 9 soldiers taking on 100 Filipino rebels, many did not see the purpose of fighting this war. Along with the poor mistreatment that many of the soldiers faced from their white commanding officers and soldiers, a lot of them had a moral dilemma, as the native Filipinos had darker skin. A good chunk of them didn't feel comfortable fighting against people with similar skin tones to them, with most seeing this as another example of white imperialism on the colored people, with the white troops even calling native Filipinos niggers, a slur definitely associated with African Americans, and the constant war crimes against the rebels and even the civilian population was prevalent. Because of this extreme overt racism, there were some mixed feelings among the troops. Many still wanted to fight for the US and prove their loyalty, with some even joining in the war crimes, with one soldier admitting to his wife that he tortured Filipino prisoners, while there were others who wanted nothing to do with this imperialistic conflict and would desert, with even some joining the Filipino rebels. Such is the case with David Fagan, a Buffalo Soldier who would become a commander of the rebels. Because of this, the US military thought it would be best to take the Buffalo Soldiers out of the Philippines and bring them back to the States. When the Buffalo Soldiers returned to the United States, they were given a variety of jobs. One of the more least known jobs is that they would serve as America's first park rangers. Here, the 9th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry would be placed in the Sierra Nevada region of California, where they would be stationed in Yosemite, Sequoia, and General Grant, now called Kings Canyon, National Parks. Here, the soldiers would plant trees, protect the park from illegal grazing, poachers, timber thieves, and forest fires. One of the standouts of these park rangers was Charles Young, who was the 3rd black graduate of West Point, but also the 1st black National Park Superintendent, the 1st black military attaché, which for those who don't know are military officers who are used for diplomatic missions, and the 1st black colonel in the US Army, being the highest ranked black officer at the time. However, it wasn't always the best, as there was constantly tension between the Buffalo Soldiers and the white civilians in the towns they were stationed in, especially in the state of Texas. The worst was in Houston in August of 1917. After an incident where the police harassed the local black community and black soldiers, a rumor spread that one of the soldiers was killed by the police officers. Enraged, the troops of the 24th Infantry Regiment rose up and rioted in Houston, killing 11 white civilians and 4 police officers. Because of this, 19 soldiers were executed and 41 sentenced to life in prison. Throughout the 1910s, Mexico was embroiled in a bloody civil war. Describing the Mexican Revolution is a topic on its own, but let's just say it was a very messy conflict. The fighting would go out to its borders, but the US wouldn't truly get involved until after Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. This is because Villa felt that the United States betrayed him by supporting one of his rivals. Angered by this, the United States would send troops to Mexico to capture Villa and secure their own interests. Sound familiar? The Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry Regiments were sent down along with the other American troops to Mexico to subdue the Mexico rebels in Villa, which they never succeeded. The Buffalo Soldiers, along with the rest of the US troops trying to find Villa, would leave Mexico around 1970, right when the United States was entering World War I. Still, the Buffalo Soldiers would continue to fight Mexican troops and rebels near the US-Mexico border, with them taking part in the Battle of Ambos Nogales in 1918, along with the White 35th Infantry Regiment, where they would take on the coalition of Mexican government soldiers, rebels, and even suspected German soldiers. The battle ended in American victory. Now, the original divisions of the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Regiments did not participate in the First World War. However, a new generation of black soldiers who fought in the First World War would carry the name of the Buffalo Soldiers. In 1917, the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions would be established and carry on the Buffalo Soldier tradition, with the former using the buffalo as their symbol, even calling themselves the Buffalo Division. That being said, these guys are not to be confused with the Harlem Hellfighters, who were their own separate group. That being said, like the Harlem Hellfighters and many other African American troops, the Buffalo Soldiers technically didn't fight for the United States Army. Let me explain. This came down to the decision of one man, General John J. Pershing. Pershing was actually a commander of the Buffalo Soldiers during the Spanish-American War and the US invasion of Mexico. While having tremendous respect for the black troops, in fact, one could argue that he was quite progressive for his time, his compatriots found this to be a weakness of his to the point where they would refer to him as Nigger Jack, though later it was softened to Black Jack. Pershing faced tremendous pressure from the United States government as President Woodrow Wilson and the Southern Democrats didn't want the Buffalo Soldiers to fight in the US Army. Not to mention, a lot of the white troops didn't want to fight alongside blacks as well. Pershing, who tried to defend the soldiers, did not fight back much against the racist establishment. However, Pershing also faced pressure from African American leaders who felt like the black troops should serve in the front to prove themselves. So Pershing makes a compromise. He won't let the black troops fight for the United States Army, but he'll let them fight for the French. The French were used to fighting alongside their African colonial troops, and they were just happy to get more reinforcements. And Germany was planning one final attack on the Western Allies. against the Western Allies. The United States would try to give the French advice on not treating the black troops with dignity and respect. The French just downright ignored those demands. The 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions would fight in the Second Battle of the Marne and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, where the Western Allies would push back the Germans. Here the Buffalo Soldiers would take out key German positions, with the 93rd Division showcasing their bravery by retaking several French towns and taking 600 German prisoners. They would even bring their culture along with them, as they would be the ones to introduce the Europeans to jazz. Here the Buffalo Soldiers will be awarded 2 Medals of Honor, 75 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 527 Croix de Guerre medals, the French Army's highest award. Unfortunately, when they came back to the States, they came back to the same racism and discrimination that they left, if not worse. Here they would face the most horrible racist violence of the century, such as the Chicago race riots of 1919 and the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, with some incidents of the soldiers being lynched in their own uniforms. Not only that, but because they technically didn't fight for the US Army, they were denied veteran benefits. Despite fighting to keep the world safe for a democracy that didn't want them, the Buffalo Soldiers proved themselves with such valor in the so-called war to end all wars. The Second World War is where Black Americans would truly shine. However, at first, they weren't welcomed. The US military originally did not want African Americans to fight in the war. The best you got if you joined the Army was either as a manual laborer or a truck driver. Still better than the Navy, where you received no training and was regulated to either being a janitor or a food server. Which is a huge insult, as one of the first American heroes of the war was Doris Miller, a cook without any training manned a machine gun and shot down 6 Japanese planes during the attack on Pearl Harbor, saving several sailors' lives that day. When many of the white troops started dying in vast numbers, the military got desperate and said, "Screw it," and let African Americans fight, and expanded their roles. Whether it was the famous Tuskegee Airmen, or the 761st Tank Battalion, or even the Black Division of the Women's Army Corps, Black Americans in the military started to expand and show what they can do. However, it took a lot of fighting both on the battlefield and at home and faced many difficulties to come. The old regiments of the Buffalo Soldiers were slowly starting to fade out. The 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiment did not see combat, but instead were used as service units where they would help keep supplies during the war and soon would be disbanded. That being said, the 92nd Division would make its return and would spend 2 years of training until finally, in July 1944, it was allowed to see combat in Italy. Along with the all-African American 758 Tank Battalion, whose mascot instead of a buffalo was a black elephant, and all of the troops' African heritage and show how tough they were. The Italian front of the Second World War is usually forgotten as it was seen as a dumping ground for both sides, where soldiers of all races and nationalities, the outcasts and misfits that no one wanted, would be placed there. For the Nazis, it was seen as a buffer zone to keep the Americans and British at bay, all the while trying to keep up its dying Italian ally. While for the Western Allies, it was seen as the distraction for the Germans, all the while everyone focused on the more well-known Western and Eastern fronts. I really want to say, like their counterparts during the First World War, the 92nd Division proved how tough and brave they were and broke through the German lines, retaking Italian town after Italian town, and showing that they were up to task. I really want to say that. But unfortunately, the truth of the 92nd Division's combat record is a lot more complicated. In an attempt to break through the Gothic line in central Italy, they were faced off against the infamous Italian 4th Monte Rosa Alpine Division and the 1st Bersaglieri Division, where they were constantly beaten back. The 92nd was poorly trained, given outdated weapons, and had low morale. And while many blamed the Buffalo Soldiers, seeing them as inferior and proving that black men can't fight in the battlefield, but in reality it was the fault of their commanding officer, Major General Edward Ullman. You see, at the time, many African American military units were commanded by white officers from the American South, as it was believed that because they were around black people the most, they knew how to handle them. But this backfired because the white Southern officers would bring their racial prejudices with them and it would create a poor relationship with their troops. Now, I do want to point out that not all white officers did treat their black soldiers with such disdain. For example, the commanding officer of the 761st Tank Battalion, Paul Bates, refused that his troops be segregated and fought hard for them to see combat. Ullman would speak poorly of his men and blamed them for not getting the job done and that the performance in battle had cost him a promotion.
What an asshole!
I'm not even far off with that statement. Even if he wasn't racist, Ullman was a terrible commander and an arrogant jackass, and he would have the same trouble with white troops in Korea a few years later with his fellow officers hating his guts. The only reason his career wasn't in ruins was because he knew people in high places. But it shows why the 92nd had a poor combat record, and because of that poor combat record, they were given unexpected help. Being the subject of an experiment done by the Army, here the 92nd Division would be integrated with the white 473rd Division and the battle-hardened Japanese-American 442nd Infantry Regiment. For those who don't know, the 442nd Infantry was made up of second-generation Japanese Americans who were suspected of being enemies due to their national origin as the US was at war with Japan, with many of them and their families being forced into internment camp. Despite this, many Japanese American men joined the fight where they would prove their bravery and fighting skills in southern France, and thus they were transferred to help the 92nd. Along with the 442nd, the 92nd would fight alongside other 9 white troops from different countries, such as Arabs, West Africans, and Indians, and even some white European troops such as Poles, Greeks, and even anti-fascist Italian forces. And along the way, they would also fight side by side with the non-segregated Brazilian expeditionary forces, which surprised a lot of the troops. With the help of these troops, the 92nd Division would finally get a chance to prove themselves and sort of work their way out across the Italian peninsula, breaking the Gothic line in late April 1945, taking the towns of La Spezia and Genoa. 2 members of the 92nd would become famous later on. Cartoonist Ted Shearer, who would become one of the first black cartoonists to have a long-running comic strip called Quincy, and Jackie Robinson, the one who broke the color barrier in baseball. He was actually a part of the 758 Tank Battalion, but because he was facing a court-martial case due to poor behavior, he wasn't allowed to see combat. The 93rd Division, which had the 25th Infantry Regiment with it, had better luck where they would fight in the Pacific theater of the war. Here they would fight on the islands of New Guinea where they would take on Japanese forces. Later on, they would be used to clear out the last remaining Japanese resistance on the island. And finally, on the island of Morotai, the division would achieve its biggest victory. as on August 2nd, 1945, they would capture Colonel Kiso Uji, who was the highest-ranked Japanese commander to be captured before the end of the war, and later capture 41,000 Japanese troops. The 24th Infantry Regiment also saw combat in the Pacific, though they weren't attached to the 93rd. Originally, they were used more for defense as they were stationed on the Solomon Islands. Later, they would participate in the battles of Saipan and Okinawa, which were the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. When the soldiers came home, they were hoping that things had changed and that their bravery on the front lines proved their worth. Unfortunately, many of them set themselves up for disappointment. After 4 years of fighting the totalitarian and racist regimes of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, the soldiers came back to the same racism that they fought so hard against. Many were even denied the benefits of the GI Bill and were not allowed to own homes or apply for well-paying jobs. This policy still has effect on their descendants to this day. The Buffalo Soldiers, like those became before them, had to face the stings of racism and mistrust from their white counterparts. And while they had many difficulties to prove themselves on the battlefield, in the end they showed how much they helped with the war effort of the United States. Impressed with the performances of black servicemen during World War II, in July 1948, President Harry S. Truman would enact Executive Order 9981, where the United States military would finally be desegregated. Though it would take some time for the US military to get used to the new policy. Here we would have the last remaining Buffalo Soldiers in the United States Army, the 24th Infantry Regiment. In the late 1940s, the unit was stationed on Okinawa, but soon will see their final act of combat. In June 1950, North Korea would invade South Korea. The United States, in desperate need to help its South Korean ally, needed troops, so the 24th would be sent to Korea, where they would be the first Americans to face off against the North Korean advancement. Here they managed to hold them off until American and US forces managed to cut off the North Korean army and help push them back up the Korean peninsula. However, like many American troops, the 24th Infantry would get a nasty surprise when Communist China entered the war in late 1950 to help North Korea. Here the Chinese would perform a counterattack that would push the 24th Regiment along with other American forces back down Korea. Despite suffering the same problems as the white soldiers, the 24th were considered to be terrible soldiers, with one of the few black commanding officers, Lieutenant Leon Gilbert, being court-martialed and scheduled to be executed when he refused the orders of a white officer. Though his sentence was later changed to life in prison, but he only served 5 years. This demoralized the 24th as it would lead to tension between black and white soldiers, with some of the Buffalo Soldiers deserting their positions. Seeing this discourse, the Chinese would take the opportunity to try to recruit black prisoners of war to their cause. And even back home, many African Americans were protesting the war. However, in the spring and summer of 1951, the 24th Infantry managed to get their stuff together and help push back the Chinese and North Korean forces. Despite this comeback, the 24th's reputation was already tarnished and they were seen as a lost cause. In October 1951, the 24th Infantry Regiment was disbanded, with many of their troops going to more integrated units. Another unit called the 2nd Ranger Infantry was a unit of special forces who would conduct missions behind enemy lines, which they would earn the nickname the Buffalo Rangers, being the first black Army Rangers. One of the best achievements of the Buffalo Rangers was that they had the lowest casualty rate of all the special forces, while inflicted many losses on Chinese and North Korean forces. In August 1951, the unit was disbanded, but not for the reasons you would think. Unlike the 24th, the military was actually impressed with the 2nd Ranger Infantry's combat record, and felt like them being a segregated unit hindered their full potential. Thus is the end of the Buffalo Soldiers. Despite being seen as troublemakers and at one sour stint during the campaign, throughout the first year of the Korean War, the 24th Infantry would show that they still got it and fought as hard as they could, holding off North Korean and Chinese advancements, with 2 of the Buffalo Soldiers earning the Medal of Honor. Sadly, not much was known about the 24th's achievement as their records were buried and the military didn't have much faith in them. All the while, the 2nd Ranger Infantry had better luck, though some of their actions seems like they have been forgotten as well. And that, my friends, is the triumph and tragedy of the Buffalo Soldiers. In recent years, the story of them has garnered both praise and criticism. Praise as they were seen as role models for African Americans and showing how brave they were in the midst of the battlefield. Despite a racist system that tried to keep them down, they managed to pull through and prove themselves worthy. However, they garnered criticism for fighting for said racist system that not only tried to keep them down, but were seen as tools by that system to exploit and conquer other people of color such as Native Americans, Filipinos, and Mexicans. While there's truth to both sides of this argument, despite all the hardships these soldiers have been through, one cannot deny their achievements. While they started off with a bang and sadly went away with no fanfare in the end, one should not forget about the Buffalo Soldiers.